Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. Today, we're picking up with part 2 of the Boys on the Tracks case, which examines the strange and mysterious deaths of 16-year-old Don Henry and his best friend, 17-year-old Kevin Ives of Arkansas, who were run over by a train in August of 1987. Now, their deaths were initially ruled as accidental, with the state medical examiner, Dr. Fahmy Malik, making all sorts of claims that the boys had ingested so much marijuana they'd gone into a deep slumber on a set of railroad tracks. Malik stated that because they were in such a deep sleep, they had not heard or felt the enormous train bearing down on them, and they'd been alive when the train struck. In part 1, we discussed who Kevin and Don were, along with their parents, who would become their greatest advocates in the years following their deaths. We talked about what the train crew saw as they approached Kevin and Don on the tracks, and we talked about the first responders and their impressions of the scene, along with the lack of care and cooperation given to Don and Kevin's parents from the Saline County Sheriff's Office and the medical examiner, Dr. Malik. When we left off, the two sets of parents had started receiving some help from two men, Richard Garrett, an attorney, along with his friend and law partner, Dan Harmon, also an attorney. Now, these two lawyers began setting the wheels in motion to have a prosecutor's hearing about the case, which would hopefully lead to the ME's decision being overturned, which would then hopefully lead to a grand jury being called in order to investigate the real reason behind the deaths of the two teenage boys who had certainly not fallen asleep on train tracks. But before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's episode. December means a lot of things. It means the end of the year. It means snow and cold temperatures for a lot of us. It means the holidays and family gatherings. But I bet you didn't know that December is also Identity Theft Prevention and Awareness Month. Identity theft is not only the fastest growing crime, but it is also ranked as one of Americans' most feared crimes. And with everything going on this holiday season, and with all of us doing a lot of online shopping, maybe putting our credit card numbers into multiple sites that we maybe aren't even checking into because we're too busy checking off gifts on a list, the last thing you want to worry about is having to deal with identity theft or someone stealing your financial information. If you are not using a VPN on your electronics, you're vulnerable, and Surfshark VPN is the best option out there, hands down. Surfshark VPN secures your data with industry-leading measures by using uncrackable encryption and the most secure VPN protocols. Surfshark also provides IP and DNS leak protection so that nobody can figure out where you're connecting from, and they maintain a strict no-logs policy that now works even better with Surfshark's 100% RAM-only server network and British Virgin Island jurisdiction. With Surfshark VPN, you can even feel safe doing your online Christmas shopping at your favorite coffee shop using public Wi-Fi because Surfshark encrypts your data, making it useless to anyone who tries to steal it. I've been using Surfshark on all of my devices for years, and with their subscription, you can install and run Surfshark not only on all of your devices, but on an unlimited number of devices. That means your phone, tablet, computer, as well as, your parents' cell phones and computers, your kids' cell phones and computers, and gaming systems. We can't keep our loved ones off the internet, but we can help keep them protected and safe while they're there. Surfshark VPN also has apps for all platforms: PC, Mac, Linux, Android, iOS, smart TVs, Amazon Fire Stick, Apple TV, Chrome, Firefox, Xbox, and PlayStation. And once you install Surfshark and start protecting your internet privacy, you can also take advantage of all the other amazing features Surfshark has to offer. With Surfshark VPN, you can unlock 15 of the largest Netflix country libraries, including the US and Japan. All you have to do is connect to a server in whichever country you choose. So for instance, I love British television, and I used to have to wait for all of the shows to air over in the UK and then make their way across the pond, but now I can connect to a server in the UK and watch the shows as they're released there. You can access BBC iPlayer, Hulu, and other limited streaming services wherever you are. Not only that, but Surfshark VPN is for play and or work, and it lets you overcome location-based price discrimination on things like plane tickets and car rentals. So Surfshark also comes in clutch when traveling abroad because it allows you to connect to a server in your country, which is going to avoid bank freezes. This has happened to me once, because whenever you're traveling in a different country and your credit card sees that you're in a different country, it thinks maybe your credit card got stolen, so it shuts it down. This took forever to fix, and when you're in a different country and, you need to spend money, it's awful. I never want that to happen again, and with Surfshark, it won't. And with a 30-day money-back guarantee, which gives you plenty of time to try Surfshark VPN risk-free and 24/7 live customer support who are ready to help you in a friendly and timely manner whenever issues arise, you literally have nothing to lose. You need to check out Surfshark VPN right now by going to surfshark.com/stephanieharlowe. Not only are you going to get the best VPN on the market, but Surfshark is going to give you 4 extra months. So click the link in the description box or go to surfshark.com/stephanieharlowe to protect your online privacy today. Thank you so much to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. I want to open this episode up with a recall of what the police were saying to the media during the early days of the investigation. On August 26, 1987, the Arkansas Democrat reported that a preliminary autopsy had indicated both Kevin and Don were alive when the train struck them. The article also mentions that the train crew did not see either of the boys move. The article states that the lack of clues about the incident have created several rumors, one of which was that the boys were tied to the tracks and shot. Deputy Rick Elmendorf assured the media outlet that this wasn't true because the initial autopsy had found that there were no stab wounds, no gunshot wounds, and no blunt trauma to the head. This is when Elmendorf stated with his whole chest that, quote, "We haven't ruled out anything except foul play," end quote, which I think is ruling out quite a bit, right? It's ruling out a lot. So before the prosecutor's hearing began, a few experts weighed in on the findings of Dr. Fahmy Malak. Dr. Arthur McBray was the chief toxologist for the North Carolina Medical Examiner's Office, as well as a former medical examiner for the state of Massachusetts. McBray was also a professor of pathology and pharmacology at the University of North Carolina, and he had worked with medical examiners since 1955. He'd been involved in marijuana studies for the past 3 decades, and at the time, he was considered to be one of the country's foremost experts on the study of this substance, marijuana, cannabis, THC, Mary Jane, whatever you want to call it. So McBray flatly disagreed with Dr. Malak's characterization of what had happened to Kevin Ives and Don Henry, and he stated that smoking marijuana, even a lot of it, would not render a person unconscious. McBray said, quote, "I've known of incidents where persons smoked 21 marijuana cigarettes, one right after the other. They would become euphoric, but it doesn't make them unconscious. I don't know what kind of evidence you could use to possibly conclude this. I have never heard of anyone becoming unconscious from this under ordinary circumstances. Marijuana is not a drug like that. It doesn't force an unconscious state. It's not even a drug normally connected with hallucinogens," end quote. To be fair, I have never heard of anyone becoming euphoric after smoking 21 marijuana cigarettes back to back. Like, you wouldn't be falling asleep on train tracks, I agree, but you would not be euphoric. You would be sick. You would be what they call greened out, in my opinion, just from my experience. But yeah, 21 back to back, that's crazy. So McBray also acknowledged that it was possible to smoke any kind of cigarette so fast that a person could hyperventilate, and that person might then lose consciousness. But that loss of consciousness would only be for a very short time. McBray went even further, questioning whether Dr. Malak even had the experience or expertise to make these findings, saying, quote, "On what basis was that finding made? It's very bizarre. I don't know who would agree with it. In this case, I don't believe it. Marijuana doesn't even make people take risks," end quote. McBray pointed to experiments that had been done where blood was drawn from a person who was smoking weed every minute. The person wasn't smoking weed every minute. They were smoking weed, and then blood was drawn from them every minute. And he said, quote, "Those persons reached their peak in 5 minutes, and after that it went back down. It just won't make you go unconscious and go into a deep sleep. As far as going to sleep, marijuana is not used as a sedative. It might relax tension and could help someone go off to sleep if they'd gone to bed, but they would still be able to respond to stimuli. They would not remain in a stupor like they might with alcohol. Lack of consciousness could happen happen with PCP or a drug of that nature or with an excessive amount of alcohol, end quote. McBray also stated that medical examiners usually don't even look for marijuana when trying to determine cause of death because it would be like looking for nicotine. He said, quote, you might know someone had smoked a cigarette, but you wouldn't be looking for that as the cause of death, end quote. Going further, McBray asserted that there was no method which could accurately specify the concentration of THC in a person's blood. He said, quote, I think the burden should be on the state or the individual who made that conclusion. When I see this kind of result, it's usually someone who doesn't know a damn thing about marijuana or the testing, end quote. And this is true. Testing blood for THC can be challenging for several reasons. THC is metabolized very quickly in the body, and it doesn't stay in the bloodstream for very long. After consumption, THC rapidly enters the brain and other tissues, and within a few hours, it's broken down into metabolites. While the metabolites can be detected in urine for days or weeks after use, the THC itself is typically only detectable in the blood for a short time, usually up to a few hours. Also, people metabolize THC at different rates in general, and factors such as body fat, metabolic rate, frequency of use, and the type of THC consumed can all affect how it's cleared from the blood, how quickly it's cleared from the blood. Additionally, THC levels in the bloodstream in general can be quite low, making it difficult to detect, and it's definitely difficult to detect how much somebody has smoked. You can detect the presence of THC, but it's really difficult, especially using a blood sample, to figure out how much THC a person consumed by the blood sample. The blood concentration tends to peak shortly after consumption, and then it drops rapidly. And this was all especially true in the 80s, but even now, with all the medical and testing advancements that we have, it's still a challenge to get an accurate answer as to how much THC is or was in someone's system through blood testing. Another expert, Dr. James C. Harriott of San Antonio, Texas, who is a specialist in drug detection, stated that Dr. Malik's methods seemed standard, but he doubted the reliability of some of his conclusions. And Harriott said, quote, for confirmation of cannabinoids in blood, the only completely reliable technique is mass spectrometry. I am sure that this was not done in this case, end quote. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Dr. Harriott also talked about the intoxicating effects of marijuana, saying, quote, although it induces a dreamy euphoric state, it does not directly induce sleep. It is unlikely that an individual would be affected by marijuana even in a high dose to the extent that he would be totally unaware of his surroundings or be unable to respond to a threatening noise or other threatening circumstances, end quote. Dr. Donald McMillan, the chairman of pharmacology at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, added his opinion to the fray, stating, quote, I don't think you could put someone in a deep enough sleep like an anesthetic where they couldn't be aroused by an approaching freight train, end quote. And Dr. McMillan's main area of research was marijuana, and his special projects had been funded by grants from the National Institute of Drug Abuse for the past 2 decades. He said that maybe using that much marijuana could have prevented Don and Kevin from understanding the gravity of the situation that they were facing, or even from realizing accurately, like how close the train was to them. But the fact that Don and Kevin had not moved at all, not an inch, not a muscle, not a twitch, nothing. They hadn't moved at all as that train got closer and closer. It did not make sense in the scenario described. And I mean, we're in 2024, almost 2025 now. So I think a lot of people have more experience with marijuana than they did in the 80s. I think that a lot more people are using it than they were in the 80s. It's just more commonplace and more mainstream. And I think a lot of you out there that I'm talking to today have experience with marijuana, and you understand what they're talking about. Yeah, it makes you feel relaxed. It makes you, feel more, I guess, stress-free. But would it put you in a coma to the point where you couldn't hear or feel a train coming towards you? No, absolutely not. In February of 1988, 33 subpoenas went out to witnesses who would be called to testify in the prosecutor's hearing. The witnesses included, amongst others, EMTs Shirley Raper and Billy Heath, Benton, Arkansas Police Chief Rick Elmdorf, who'd been the chief deputy sheriff at the time of Kevin and Don's deaths, Saline County investigator Chuck Talent, the crew members of the train, and of course, Dr. Fahmy Malak. So Deputy Prosecutor Richard Garrett told the Benton Courier that he'd called for the investigation because the parents of the boys, quote, obviously don't feel they have found out everything they need to find out, and I really feel like we have an obligation to provide them with that information, and they have the right to receive it, end quote. The Iveses and the Henrys were vocally overjoyed and optimistic about what this new investigation and hearing would reveal and what it meant as far as getting justice for their sons. Curtis Henry said, quote, we're finally on the road to getting some answers. I am just tickled to death about this, end quote. Maybe I wouldn't use those words. Like, that wouldn't be my choice of words. I'm tickled to death about this, but tickled pink about this. But that's Curtis Henry. That's what he chose to use. And Kevin's father, Larry Ives, said that Garrett had asked them to prepare a list of questions that they wanted answers to during the prosecutor's hearing. And Ives said, quote, instead of us going to people and asking questions, now certain parties are coming to us. Maybe there will finally be some answers that come out in court, end quote. And answers would, in fact, come out during court. The hearing lasted 3 days and took place at the Benton Courthouse in front of Circuit Court Judge John Cole. During the hearing, Bryant police officer Danny Allen testified that there had been a second train at the scene of the incident at the railroad crossing near Arkansas 111 the night of the incident. And Allen was one of the first people to respond to the scene. He got there just moments after deputies Kathy Carty and Pat Hawkins, and he said that both trains were traveling in the same direction on adjacent tracks. Allen claimed that about 2 or 3 minutes after he arrived, the other train slowly pulled away from the impact site. And as it turns out, no search was done prior to the departure of that second train. And the existence of a second train had not been known to the parents of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. They had not been told about this prior to that day in court. So it kind of seems like maybe this was something law enforcement didn't want, officially on the record. They didn't want this known. Officer Danny Allen said he had assisted other officers in searching for the green tarp, and he also talked about being on patrol on August 17th around 5 a.m. on Shobe Road, about 2 miles from where the boys were struck on the train tracks. This would have been about 5 days before the incident, and Allen testified to seeing a man walking down the road towards a place called Ranchette Estates. Allen said he turned the lights of his squad car on and the man raised a pistol at Allen's vehicle. He fired and shattered the lights before running off into the woods. Earlier that night, Bryant police had received a report that a man fitting the same description had jumped out of a vehicle on Arkansas 111 and pointed a gun at some other people. Now, the night before the boys died, Bryant police had received a suspicious person report, which described a man dressed in a green jumpsuit about 5 blocks from the railroad crossing. And the description of this man was similar to the description of the man involved in the August 17th sightings of that guy with a gun. State Trooper Wayne Lanehart, who we've already talked about, he arrived on the scene. He thought it was kind of odd, thought it didn't really look like an accident, but since the state police didn't have jurisdiction, he really wasn't able to do much. Well, he testified that he'd seen pieces of particle board near the impact site, and he said, quote, I speculated that the children were lying on the particle board because other items like the flashlight and scope were found near the particle board, end quote. He's referring to the scope of the gun. Now, this leads us to wonder if the particle board that Lanehart saw was the same one that Larry Ives had turned into the state crime lab, or at least the one he thought he was turning into the state crime lab. And this particle board had not been mentioned in any law enforcement reports. So remember, Wayne Lanehart, he's state trooper, he sees it, but he's not writing a report about it because it's not his case, it's not his jurisdiction. The other officers on the scene definitely would have seen that particle board. Why didn't they put it in their report? So EMTs Billy Heath and Shirley Raper also testified about the blood at the scene not looking fresh, and Heath said that when they got out of the ambulance, he had pointed out various body parts, including 3 feet, to the sheriff's deputies, and as we know, only 2 feet were recovered by law enforcement, and that 3rd foot was found by members of the Henry family and also by friends of the Henry family. So George Moore, who was the ambulance supervisor, testified about being the one to tell the private investigator, Ray Love, that the hospital had no report of the incident, an EMT report, and he said this confusion was the result of a misunderstanding. Moore claimed that when ambulance personnel do not administer treatment, their report would be placed into something called a no pickup file, which was located in his office. Moore claimed that he was under the impression that Ray Love, the PI, was requesting a report of treatment administered to the victims, and the report in his office included no names, so he hadn't understood which incident the investigator was inquiring about. Because I guess there's two teenage boys getting run over by trains happening just multiple times a day. You're so confused. You're like, wait, which incident was that? Two kids that got run over by a train? I mean, that just happens several times a day. How am I supposed to find this report, right? Moore also claimed he was unaware that a detailed report had ever actually been made. Moore, Raper, and Heath were all asked a question that every witness who testified during the hearing was asked. And this question was, has anyone tried to influence your testimony this day? For the prosecutor's hearing, did anybody try to influence what you were going to say? Now, Moore and Heath said no, but Shirley Raper replied, not really. It's not a no. Some friends of Don's and Kevin's also testified, and one of them, Matt Blevins, admitted to having smoked weed with the boys the night they died, but he also said that they hadn't appeared to be intoxicated. He said they all just pretty much shared like 2 or 3 joints amongst themselves, and it was kind of just like their typical weekend sort of marijuana experience. Blevins also talked about rumors that had been circulating around Brian's youth in the months since Don and Kevin had died, and he claimed he'd heard a rumor that his friends had been going out to the train tracks that night to rip off a cocaine dealer. Matt Blevins testified that he hadn't heard this directly from the boys, but Don had told him he was trying to get some money quick because he'd apparently lost his job the week prior. However, Don didn't give Matt any indication of how he planned to acquire this money. Earlier that summer, Don had also told a few of his friends that he'd been shot at while on the railroad tracks by a man in a white pickup truck. And he'd told Matt Blevins, quote, "There's a guy that said if he caught you walking around up there, he'd chase you off the land." End quote. Speaking of a pickup truck, EMT Shirley Raper also recounted a strange encounter she'd had that night on her way to the train tracks. While searching for a place to drive the ambulance to the impact site, Shirley picked up a man in the woods who directed her to a single-lane road that led into a wooded area. So about a quarter mile into that wooded area, Shirley said that she saw headlights from a pickup truck, and she stated, quote, "The truck came off to the side. I don't know where it came from," end quote. Although Shirley herself never approached the truck, she said that she thought there were 2 people inside, but she didn't see them well enough to be able to describe them, and she thought that they could have been men. Shirley also claimed that the man she picked up got out of the ambulance and briefly spoke to the people in the truck because she had to take the ambulance, try to maneuver it around a corner of that road going through the woods. And when she came back, he was not talking to them anymore, and the truck was gone. Shirley Raper said it seemed like the man she picked up in the woods and the 2 men in the pickup truck, they all knew each other. So like I said, when that single lane road through the woods became very narrow, Shirley had to get out of the ambulance. She walked around a curve in the road to investigate to make sure that if she got past that curve, it would still be big enough for her to drive the ambulance through. And the man who had directed her to that point, to the road, he stayed in the ambulance. Shirley said that when she returned to the ambulance, the truck was gone. And she said, quote, "I didn't hear them leave. They just weren't there. It's real strange," end quote. You know what's real strange? Picking up a stranger in the woods, Shirley, and bringing him in your ambulance for some reason, and then leaving him alone in the ambulance while you walk around through a path in the woods. Do you know the kind of stuff they have in ambulances? Morphine, medication, expensive equipment. You don't even know who this dude is. But anyways, when asked why she never told the police this information, Shirley Raper said, quote, "I was never interviewed by anyone from the sheriff's office. No one has ever asked me for anything until last week," end quote. So the presence of 3 unknown men and a pickup truck in the woods right near the impact site was obviously shocking. But don't worry, because law enforcement came forward and they assured everyone that the men had been identified as Tommy Madison, Alan Smith, and Gary Pullman, and apparently they were volunteers with the Alexander Fire Department. I guess these men had heard some commotion, so they'd driven out to the scene to see if they could be of assistance. However, later it would come out that Alexander didn't have a fire department, so these guys definitely weren't who they said they were, and we're going to talk about that later. So other friends of Don and Kevin's had heard rumors that marijuana was being grown in the area where the boys were struck by the train, and one of the rumors going around was that Don and Kevin had gone out there that night to find a marijuana patch. According to law enforcement, they'd done a thorough search of the tracks and also a thorough search of a wide area around the tracks, and they had not found any marijuana patches. But I don't know if the Saline County Sheriff's Office really understands what a thorough search means, considering you missed a foot, okay? You missed body parts. So there's probably marijuana patches all over that place, honestly. Now, the general consensus of Don and Kevin's friends was summed up in one sentence, stated by 17-year-old Timothy Holloway, quote, "People said they really don't believe it was an accident," end quote. Now, by far, the most ridiculous and illuminating testimony came from our good friend Dr. Fahmy Malik, who acted like a complete clown on the stand. First, when he was initially called up to the stand, he dramatically bowed to the parents of Kevin and Don, who were sitting in the courtroom, and he announced, quote, "I want the families of these two boys to know that I forgive them for everything they have done," end quote. Gaslighting mofo, okay? Malik also had a briefcase with him, and Richard Garrett was like, "What's in your briefcase, dude?" And he was like, "These are photos, enlarged autopsy photos that I brought to this hearing for everybody to look at and view." And the parents of Kevin and Don and Richard Garrett obviously objected to this. Garrett told the judge that Malik was there to testify about toxicological evidence, and showing these pictures, it wasn't necessary. It would only torture Don and Kevin's parents, and not only that, it would continue to victimize the two boys who were dead by these pictures being shown during a public hearing where the media was present. Now, Judge Cole actually had to stop the court proceedings while Garrett called the state attorney general, who of course did absolutely nothing except give Dr. Malik another power trip. The AG said that no one could force the doctor to testify under terms other than his own. Wow. With the decision being made, Kevin and Don's parents left the courtroom, and Richard Garrett asked anyone under the age of 18 to also leave, based on, obviously, the graphic nature of the photos. He also instructed crews from 3 Little Rock news stations that they should not use any footage of the photos in their coverage of the case. But of course, they got these pictures on camera, because that's what they do. That's what reporters do. Then Dr. Malik went through each photo, pointing out injuries, which was pointless because when he was asked how the boys had died, he said that it had been THC present in their blood, which would not be shown in these photos. So it was a whole bunch of nothing, and he really just literally wanted to, waste time, run down the clock, make everybody uncomfortable. I'm not sure. Malik was also asked if he had examined the bodies to determine if there were any signs of sexual abuse, and he said he had. But when Garrett asked Malik why this hadn't been mentioned in any of his reports, Malik became defensive and sassy, saying, quote, "Well, Mr. Garrett, you just was trying to not let me use the photographs, the first photographs of the autopsy, and citing about the sensitivity about the family, the parents. Rest assured, so many families object forcibly that we check their children for homosexuality. But I am here, under oath, I am telling you, I examined these kids, and they were negative. There was no homosexual act," end quote. What the fuck? What? Wow. This guy's such an obnoxiously not self-aware fool. He's a fool. He's a complete clown. So Dr. Fahmy Malik announced with complete confidence that he would put his job on the line if it could ever be proven that Don and Kevin had not been alive at the time of impact with the train. And he said, quote, "The definite proof they were alive at the time of the crash is the aspiration of blood in the lungs. The children bled from the crash. They died of the crash," end quote. When asked if the boys' clothes had been tested for the presence of blood that didn't belong to Kevin or Don, Malik said that he had made that determination visually. He didn't need no tests, not with an ego like his. He said, quote, "I studied hematology for 2 years. Now, what I know about hematology, I don't believe a serologist knows what I know about it. If there was any evidence to tell me there's different distribution and different quality I am seeing, I will do something about it. You have to consider, too, the finding of their bodies. Like, I read you're getting witnesses to tell you the color of the blood on the scene. What do they know about blood? What causes the color of blood? What affects the color of blood? This is inflammatory. It has no relation to the death. Don't make something more than what it is. These kids died because of the crash. The train passed on them and the fact they were smoking marijuana. We are not tarnishing these kids. They are like my children. I'm not putting this marijuana in them. It was found. It's a fact. We have to accept it. And this is life." End quote. I have to go back and look at this statement again because there's a lot. There's a lot in here. All right. So first he says he studied hematology for 2 years. And what he knows about hematology, which is the study of blood, he doesn't even believe a serologist knows. How long does a serologist have to go to school to be considered, like a blood expert? So a serologist is a scientist who studies bodily fluids such as blood, saliva, semen, and urine for diagnostic purposes. It takes 9 to 12 years to become a serologist. So years 1 to 4, obtaining a bachelor's degree in a relevant field such as forensic science, biology, or chemistry. Then years 5 to 8, earning a doctorate degree in a related field. And then years 9 to 12, accumulating the necessary work experience and undergoing on-site and on-the-job training. So Dr. Malik believes that with his 2 years of studying hematology, he knows more about blood than a serologist does, who literally goes to school to study bodily fluids as like the only thing they're doing. Like it's the epitome of you've got one job. But Dr. Malik, in his egotistical way, believes that he knows more about it than a serologist. And he's saying, I can visually determine whether the blood was Kevin and Don's or somebody else's, right? Like different distribution, different quality. If I'm seeing something, I'm going to do something about it visually with my eyes. And then he's like, oh, and I hear you're getting witnesses to tell you the color of the blood on scene. And you're, referring to almost everybody who was on scene that day. Kathy Carty said it. The EMTs, Shirley Raper and Billy Heath, said it. The conductor, the engineer, they were all like, this is not fresh blood. And Dr. Malik's like, what do they know about blood? What causes the color of blood? What affects the color of blood? There's legitimate scientific evidence to show you what causes and affects the color of blood. He's asking questions, but not actually answering them, because if he answered them, he would know that oxygen or a lack of can affect the color of blood. And he's like, this is inflammatory. It has no relation to the death. The blood not being fresh when you're claiming these kids were alive when they got hit by the train has nothing to do with the death. And then he goes into his whole emotional thing, like, I didn't put the marijuana inside of them. I found it in them. We're not tarnishing their reputation. This is just a fact. This is life. This is how it is, right? Such a douchebag. So Malik also wanted everyone to know that it wasn't even his job to run tests on clothing. He said he would have submitted the clothes to the crime lab if he felt that studying the clothes would have been relevant to determining the cause of death. He said he didn't do that, though, because he didn't want to make people work for no reason. He said, quote, I don't want to submit for other people to work if not necessary. They have 75 counties, end quote. He's referring to the number of counties that submit evidence to the state crime lab. Once again, this is not a reason to not submit evidence to the state crime lab. They're busy. They got a backlog. We get it. Still not a reason to not submit the evidence, right? So Richard Garrett asked Dr. Malik about eye fluid samples, and Malik replied that samples had been submitted from Don, but not Kevin. He also claimed that he never got any results back from these samples being submitted, and he didn't even know what the purpose of testing the eye fluid would be, stating, quote, we have body fluids, blood, urine. This is extra work, extra request. This special test costs lots of money for the crime lab, end quote. Remember the first part of this series? We talked about how Dr. Malik hated the crime lab, but all of a sudden he's really concerned for their well-being. He doesn't want them to get overworked. He doesn't want them to have too much on their plate. Richard Garrett also asked Dr. Malik why one of the autopsy reports contained more details than the other. And Dr. Malik said this in response, quote, why? As simple as this. I am working 16 hours a day, Saturdays. This is a job that should be done by 5, being done by 2. Either I like it or I quit. You understand now? End quote. Well, I mean, as a person with crippling ADHD, I totally do understand. I have to be completely engrossed and interested in a topic to continue being focused on it and even continue wanting to have anything to do with it. But I'm a YouTuber who makes videos for people to watch. I'm not a medical examiner who's like doing autopsies to determine what the cause and manner of death is. And after the first one, and then I'm like doing the second one, I'm halfway through and I'm like, I'm over this. I'm bored. I'm not interested in this anymore. I've worked way too much this week. I've worked Saturday this week, okay? I just really, I'm not interested in this anymore. And I just figure I've done enough. We'll just apply everything I learned from the first autopsy to the second one. No biggie. And with his full-ass chest, Dr. Malik said there was zero evidence of beating, strangulation, stabbing, or gunshot wounds, and he was certain that both Kevin and Don had been fully alive when they'd been struck by the train. He claimed the bodies had been x-rayed, and they showed no signs of bullets, and a careful examination done by him had revealed no wounds consistent with any foul play. Remember that he said that. Zero evidence of foul play. Zero evidence of anything happening to these kids at the hands of someone else. That's what Dr. Malik said, with his whole ass chest. So Richard Garrett asked Malik if there was any way he could have missed other injuries that may have not been caused by the train. And Malik replied, in Dr. Malik fashion, quote, "Not with me. Maybe other person would miss it, but not me." End quote. No, of course not. He's perfect, right? He's absolutely perfect. Other people can make mistakes. Dr. Fahmy Malak is infallible. And then Malik, in his most clown-like, egotistical audacity, said that the boys had taken their secret with them. He said that him and everyone in the court, they were all survivors trying to explain it. But, quote, "We may never know. Don't make something more than it is. We may not ever succeed to know what happened. These are things we have to accept and live with. I see it every day." End quote. Now, Malik likes to talk about his own kids and say, I understand as a parent they want answers and I understand they're grieving. But if this was your kid and you were dealing with a medical examiner as honestly dumb as Malik is, do you not think that you would be pushing it? Don't make it something more than it is. Don't make the deaths of your children more than it is. It's just absolutely, the man has no self-awareness. Malik said that he'd had the option of ruling the deaths as being self-inflicted, homicide, or accidental. And he said that him labeling the deaths as accidental was actually a kindness to Don and Kevin. He said he was giving them the benefit of the doubt. And that's why he didn't rule the deaths as being self-inflicted. And as we're going to find out, Dr. Malik does like to rule many deaths as being self-inflicted. Malik also made another very inflammatory suggestion because dying on the hill of his own hubris and lies wasn't enough. When he was asked if there was any chance Kevin and Don could have been murdered, he replied, quote, "Could it be a homicide? There is one condition that fulfills the criteria of homicide. If the engineer is lying, he could stop and wouldn't if he was under the influence of marijuana or alcohol." End quote. So now he's like, yeah, it could be homicide. They could have been murdered by the train, by the engineer of the train, who may have been high or drunk. So the engineer of the train that had made impact with Kevin and Don's bodies was Jerry Tomlin. We've talked about him already. He was present in court that day, and later he would tell the reporters, quote, "All I've got to say about Dr. Malik's testimony is that I will go with him and be tested any day, anytime he chooses. Then we'll go to the state mental hospital and have him tested for a brain." End quote. Roasted. That's hilarious. Malik stated that the train crew should have been tested for drugs and alcohol, which led the union reps from the railroad company to give their own statement describing Malik's comments as degrading and saying, quote, "You've got to understand that the most terrible thing that can happen to a person during their career is to be involved in an accident where a life is lost. We're extremely disappointed that Dr. Malik made that statement. We think there's absolutely no foundation whatsoever for it." End quote. And you know how I know that Dr. Fahmy Malak has an ego the size of the entire universe, and why it's not just a basic level of not being self-aware or maybe even nervousness or defensiveness? he's not trying to make friends here. He's not trying to be diplomatic. He's going out on a limb to attack everyone, right? As long as you're not looking at him. He's like, well, boys could have done this to themselves. Well, could have been the train crew. They were drunk or high. Could have been, anybody else. But I don't make mistakes. So my part of this is done. My job is done. On February 26th, 5 days after the hearing ended, Richard Garrett issued a report that overturned Dr. Malik's ruling. And from there, it was a domino effect of many of Dr. Malik's past mistakes returning to haunt him. Because that same day, State Representative Mike Todd called out 2 cases that Malik had ruled as self-inflicted deaths in Greene County. And this was all kind of kickstarted by the Boys on the Tracks case. And it prompted Dick Pace, who was the president of the Arkansas Coroners Association, to take notice. Pace wanted the duties of the state medical examiner to be clarified, right? During the third and final day of the prosecutor's hearing, Malik had testified that he was authorized by state law to determine both the cause and manner of the death in the autopsies that he conducted. But according to Arkansas Statute 1212-318, the state crime lab can make examinations and conduct investigations to determine cause of death, right? Which would be gunshot wound, asphyxiation, things like that. But the law did not specifically state who should determine manner of death, which would be, is it homicide, is it accidental, is it self-inflicted? So Dick Pace told the Arkansas Democrat, quote, "I'm involved in a couple investigations now where I'm questioning the manner of death ruled by the medical examiner. The first and foremost concern is to get the coroners in the state trained. Then we want to give them a good set of laws to work with. Now they're too vague and too ambiguous. Things just aren't being done consistently," end quote. So this wasn't being posed, initially at least, as a direct attack on Dr. Fahmy Malak. It was a realization, allegedly, that the medical examiners in Arkansas needed to be better educated and better trained. But Malik certainly took it as a personal attack.
Dr. Malik refused repeated requests to talk with us. But when we caught up with him, he said people didn't like him because he's from Egypt. And he claimed he had never made a single mistake in any of the 7,000 autopsies he conducted.
People say that as the state medical examiner, you were incompetent and you bungled cases, and that Governor Clinton, for some reason, defended you and protected you. Is that the case?
You have to understand that I did 7,000 autopsies. Not one single case overturned because of me.
Not a single case?
Not one single case.
But that's just not true.
So you just heard in that clip something about the governor protecting Dr. Malik. And the governor in question at that time would have been future President Bill Clinton. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But first, let's talk about just a few of the cases which Dr. Malik performed autopsies for that were called into question. So you can see for yourself how ridiculous this person is. And I think it will help in our determination that will be ongoing of whether or not Dr. Malik was nefarious or simply an idiot who was bad at his job, or maybe a little bit of both, like a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. He sucks. He sucks. So on January 18th, 29-year-old Ricky Boozer of Paragould was pronounced dead after being found inside of a running vehicle that was parked inside his closed garage. And after an autopsy, Malik ruled that this had been a self-inflicted death. However, Ricky had suffered from MS, multiple sclerosis, for about 6 years prior to his death. And the local police had determined through their investigation that the disease had progressed to the point where Ricky had been too weak to get out of his car. It wasn't that he didn't want to, live. It wasn't that he wanted to stay in the car. He was unable to get out. Now, Dr. Malik claimed he had found no signs of MS during the autopsy, even though Ricky's doctor was like, yeah, he's been diagnosed with MS. Again, that same month, a 16-year-old boy named Donnie Long died from a gunshot wound to the head, and once again, Malik ruled that this was self-inflicted. But it turns out the gun had just gone off accidentally as he was cleaning it. Representative Mike Todd said, quote, "He really goes out on a limb when he makes those statements. I just think he's making some rulings without knowing all the facts, and I think he's extending his authority a little too far," end quote. I like how they minimize it. I just think maybe he's making decisions without actually knowing what he's talking about. Maybe he's, making himself the boss of things that he shouldn't be the boss of. That's all. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. This is an important job. The state medical examiner is an important job, not only for determining what happened to this person, but when a trial comes, if a trial comes, the ME's word is going to be holding a lot of weight. You're supposed to be able to trust them. They're supposed to be respected because of their skill set, because of their knowledge, because of the way that they can, cut open a body and read based on what they see in the body, what happened to this person. That takes a lot of intelligence. It takes a lot of training, a lot of time put into learning your craft. This is an important, highly respected position. And this dude's over here maybe he's just making decisions without knowing everything. No biggie. But wait, there's more. The death of 20-year-old Larry Hickman was ruled by Malik as being self-inflicted, but his family said based on the evidence, they believed that he'd been killed. And you don't even have to know a small percentage of the evidence to realize that absolutely he was killed. He did not do this to himself. So the victim was found dead on the kitchen floor of his parents' house with a bullet wound in his chest. But when his parents had left earlier, the victim, Larry, had been asleep in bed. And when they returned home several hours later, they could hear the sound of a blow dryer in the bathroom, which they found that this blow dryer was lying in a pool of blood on the bathroom floor. Not only that, but the bathtub faucets were turned on, but there was no blood on the faucet handles. It's kind of like somebody, went in the bathroom to clean up or something. The investigation had also determined the gun had gone off outside the house. How was the investigation determining that the gun had been shot outside the house? Well, the weapon was found outside, 7 feet away from the house, yet Larry was found dead inside the kitchen floor. And the police were like, well, yeah, he shot himself outside and then he walked in to the house and died there. But first of all, why? Why would you do that? That's ridiculous. And there was absolutely no blood found on the door handles leading into the house. So it doesn't really make sense. According to the police and the ME report, there was also no gunpowder residue found on Larry's arms or hands, which indicates that he wasn't the one who shot the gun. Okay, he just wasn't. You can't shoot a gun, especially at that close range, when you're doing it to yourself and not get gunpowder residue or GSR gunshot residue on your hands or your arms in any way, shape, or form. So the list of bad calls made by Dr. Malik goes on, and they would continue to go on even after the public heat was put on Malik. He started getting a ton of scrutiny right around this 1988 time, but he didn't stop doing what he was doing. He didn't stop being an absolute egotistical moron. There was even a case where a man was found headless, okay? He was found dead, headless. And Malik said the victim had died from an ulcer. The only reason he was headless was because the family dog had consumed his head.
Another involved James Dewey Milam, whose body was found without the head. In this case, Malik ruled the cause of death to be an ulcer. Although Milam's head had been clearly severed with a knife, Malik claimed the family pooch had bitten off the head, eaten the entire thing, and then regurgitated. Malik says he tested the dog's vomit and found traces of Milam's brain and skull. Unfortunately for Dr. Malik, Milam's head was later found. Malik, it turns out, had made up the entire story.
And you would think, because of this ridiculous call that he made, and the head's found, obviously it's not an ulcer, you would think that Malik would have some explaining to do. But he never really answered for this huge mistake. 5 years before Kevin Ives and Don Henry, a man died after being involved in a parking lot brawl. Now, this man had head injuries, and the question was, had he died from an intentional blow during the fight, or had he died from falling off the back of a pickup truck, as many witnesses testified to seeing him do? So the assistant ME performed the initial autopsy, which Dr. Malik testified under oath that he was present for, and the assistant ME ruled the manner of death undetermined. But 9 months later, Dr. Fahmy Malik reversed this decision and changed the manner of death to homicide. So during a trial, Malik testified that a bruise on the victim's collarbone matched perfectly with the butt of a rifle owned by the man who was on trial for this victim's murder. During the trial, Malik illustrated his findings to the jury by placing a transparency of the rifle butt over an enlarged autopsy photo of the victim's collarbone bruise. And he told the court, listen, this is a perfect match. He said, they fit like a rubber stamp. Now, during the trial, the defense objected to this exhibit because they hadn't been given it. You're supposed to give the defense these things in discovery. They had no idea this evidence even existed, this transparent overlay of the rifle butt. And so they asked Dr. Malik how long this evidence had existed, and Malik said, "For months. I've had it for several months." Now, the defendant was convicted of first-degree murder based mainly on this evidence. But then 5 years later, in 1988, it was revealed that the work order for that transparent overlay had been submitted only 6 days before the trial. That means he didn't have it for months. That means he sort of conveniently ordered this transparent overlay specifically for court. And then 2 crime lab employees came forward and said that Malik had not been present at the time of the autopsy, even though, like I said, he testified under oath that he had been. Now, all of these stories were coming out in the wake of the prosecutor's hearing. And it was looking really bad for Dr. Malik, and it would only get worse. Mike Vowell, a photographer with the crime lab, came forward as the person who had made that transparency overlay, and he claimed that Malik had deliberately misused the film in court by reversing it in its frame to make it fit the collarbone injury. And this guy, Mike Vowell, he said initially he thought this had been done in error, so he called it to Malik's attention. He's like, "Yo, dude, this is reversed. This isn't, accurate." And he was ignored. And we're going to come back to Dr. Malik and how much he sucks. But first, let's check back in with the status of the case of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. It was decided that the bodies of the 2 boys should be exhumed and that another autopsy should be performed on them both. Dr. Joseph Burton of Marietta, Georgia, was chosen to conduct the second autopsies. He's highly respected. He's done tons and tons of autopsies. He's a good ME, a good medical examiner. And so on April 6th, Dr. Burton and 2 assistants flew in and they began their work at the University of Arkansas Medical School. During the autopsies, Burton reviewed x-rays taken by the state crime lab, and he even requested to speak with Dr. Malik about some of the procedures that Malik had used during the initial autopsy, but Malik was apparently too busy to talk, working weekends, working Saturdays, working 12 hours a day, doing autopsies when you literally have no interest in it. Now, Dr. Burton would be able to speak about his findings during the grand jury, which was sworn in on April 28, 1988, and this was the same day that Kevin Ives would have turned 18. Richard Garrett had arranged with Judge Cole for his law partner and friend, Dan Harmon, to be the special prosecutor during the grand jury proceedings. Now, Harmon had some experience acting as a special prosecutor for a grand jury. He'd made a name for himself doing it in 1984 in the wake of the Saline Memorial Hospital scandal. So I'll give you a quick breakdown of the scandal because it is important and it is relevant. And trust me, nothing I'm telling you right now, even if it seems like a side quest, because I take side quests. Nothing I'm telling you right now is an irrelevant side quest. It is relevant. I promise it will come back into play. So in March of 1984, the Saline County Memorial Hospital administrator, E.F. Black Jr., resigned unexpectedly with no explanation, and then he was promptly admitted to an unnamed hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. And not long after that, the purchasing director of Saline Memorial Hospital was suspended, and then there was announcements from officials that the state police were investigating the hospital, and there was the possibility that a grand jury was going to be called, but no one really knew what the heck had happened at Saline Memorial Hospital to cause such a hubbub. But everyone was very curious about it, okay? Now, as it turns out, the hospital was at the center of a financial scandal that lasted more than 7 months. In November of 1984, 9 former employees had been implicated in the scandal, and they would eventually plead guilty to crimes such as misuse of hospital funds, insurance fraud, theft, falsifying medical records, and profiteering, amongst others. Now, E.F. Black Jr. himself would plead guilty to 38 of the 48 counts levied against him, and he would be sentenced to 20 years in prison, and his wife Linda received 3 years of probation for her part in and knowledge of the illegal activities happening. Now, to put it simply, Black had embezzled hospital funds to finance a party house, which he always kept supplied with, top of the line, best gourmet foods, booze, wine, along with other things like drugs and girls. Now, this party house was actually raided. And then Judge John Cole appointed Dan Harmon as the special prosecutor for the grand jury. And of course, in that position, Harmon would be in possession of all the evidence from that case, including some very interesting Jeffrey Epstein-style videotapes. Now, E.F. Black Jr. would entertain many types of people at his party house, but mainly he liked to host high-level state leaders and politicians, people who were in positions of power and influence, people who were happy to partake in the drinks and the drugs and the debauchery, but who were not aware that each and every room in this party house had been fitted with secret cameras and recording devices. So Dan Harmon suddenly had in his hands a stockpile of shocking evidence and a wealth of potential blackmail material against some of the most powerful figures in Arkansas. Now, we aren't really quite ready to dive into all of that mess yet, but you know we will. What I want you to take from this is that although Dan Harmon appeared to be on the side of the Iveses and the Henrys, although he appeared to be on the side of justice, he might not have been such a noble figure after all. And in fact, there is some heavy evidence that he may have even been involved somehow in the deaths of Kevin Ives and Don Henry, that he was actually physically present at the tracks the night of their death. And this is just the tip of the iceberg as to how deep this corruption goes. But of course, at this point, Curtis and Marvell Henry, along with Linda and Larry Ives, they had no idea that the hands of the man they had placed their trust in may not have been so clean. They were pleased with his involvement in the grand jury, and Curtis Henry told the press, quote, "I depend on Danny and Richard. If they say let's try it, I say let's try it. I'm behind them 100%, end quote. The grand jury was sworn in at the end of April. The month before that had been a hard one for Dr. Fahmy Malak, because not only were the papers and the media pulling out all the skeletons from his closet, at least professionally, other experts have started weighing in on their determination of what had happened to Kevin and Don. Dr. Lee F. Beamer, who, remember, he was an acquaintance of Dr. Malik's, and Dr. Malak had told him, hey, I'm working in the crime lab as the ME in Arkansas, and Beamer had gone there to get a job because he was highly qualified, far more qualified than Dr. Malak could ever hope to be, even in his most delusional fever dreams. So Dr. Beamer was a former employee of the state crime lab, and he'd also become an independent forensic pathologist. He reviewed the materials connected to the autopsies of Kevin and Don. This included x-rays, autopsy results, and slides containing tissue and fluid samples. And Dr. Beamer stated that he believed Malak should have listed the manner of death in both cases as undetermined because, quote, neither the investigations of the deaths nor the post-mortem examinations were complete, end quote. Beamer's report, which the Benton Courier got a hold of, also said, quote, it is well known to most pathologists that the massive trauma to most parts of the body makes it impossible to say with certainty there was no preceding and possibly incapacitating trauma of similar type. As long as the preceding trauma is of the same type and sustained near the time of death, separating in time cannot be made, end quote. Basically, this report is saying that since the train that ran over Don and Kevin caused so much damage to their bodies, there's really no possible way of ruling out something like blunt force trauma to the head, which could have been caused by the train, but could have also happened before the impact of the train. And Beamer's report gets very specific with what he observed from the autopsy evidence. He said that possible strangulation of Don Henry was an option, and it couldn't be ruled out due to the damage of Don's organs. And he stated that he believed the boys were either alive when the train hit or had died shortly before. He also wrote that multiple witnesses seeing the boys covered by a green tarp did indicate the presence of at least one other person at the scene, the person who had covered them after laying them down on the tracks. And what Beamer really drove home was that Dr. Malak had not followed proper procedure in conducting these autopsies. Among many other mistakes made, Dr. Malak had not listed dental findings. He hadn't listed the weight of Don Henry's organs. Kevin Ives' organ weight was listed, but it was inaccurate. Like the weight that Malak had said Kevin's organs were was actually impossible and made no sense. The autopsy pictures had not been taken correctly. 7 of the x-rays taken weren't usable because they hadn't been marked or identified, so no one even knew really what they were of, or if the x-rays even came from Kevin or Don. All of this is being reported in the papers. And then randomly, and this is kind of a little side quest, but it's only going to take 2 minutes because I think it's funny. Randomly, amongst all the bad press that Malak is getting, an opinion piece popped up titled, State Medical Examiner Deserves Respect, Not Criticism. And I swear to God, Fahmy Malak wrote this shit, even though it's under the name Kermit B. Chanel, which is a fake name if I've ever heard one. Dr. Malak wrote this. I will allegedly, don't come from me, just my opinion this, but let me know in the comments you agree with me, right? So in the opinion piece, this person, Kermit, allegedly, says, quote, all cases on which Dr. Malak works are done in a professional way. There is no single case that is more important than another, and each case is handled by Dr. Malak in a professional manner. Forensic scientists like Dr. Malak are, in a way, guardians of society. Oh my God. It's getting deep in here. Their mission is to protect life through the lessons we learn from death. The job Dr. Malak performs is not made any easier when he has to defend himself against meaningless rumors spread by the press and public. End quote. Okay, Malak, Kermit. These were not meaningless rumors. There was an abundance of proof that Malak was an egomaniac without the credentials or brain cells to support his own high self-opinion. People who had lost loved ones and then also had to deal with an incorrect ruling of how and why their loved ones had died, they were speaking out. And there was a growing cry from the public and these family members to have Malak not only investigated, but prosecuted for crimes. People were angry.
Media coverage of Malak's dishonest rulings resulted in a massive public outcry, calling for his removal from office.
The medical examiner comes up, and he has fabrication to where he has created his own evidence.
This is of a magnitude that could create a national scandal, and if necessary, it will.
I have work.
Dr. Malak, you know me.
I have work to do.
Yes.
Me, what do you mean?
And you can say that you are Dr. Malak.
Lying on his autopsy cases, lying in court. And he's not an honest person.
And he should be prosecuted.
He should be prosecuted.
Okay, so the grand jury. Now, what happens during a grand jury, it's supposed to be kept private from the public, but transcripts of what went down in this particular grand jury would later be leaked. This does happen sometimes in very high-profile cases, usually. Dr. Fahmy Malak was obviously called to the stand, and he testified. I'm going to leave it at that. The very next day, a man named Ralph Turbyfill, who was the acting director of the state crime lab, which means Fahmy Malak is his boss, right? I know he's the director of the crime lab, but the state ME is still above the director of the state crime lab. So Ralph Turbyfill, he requested to speak to Judge Cole. And during this conversation that actually took place in front of everybody who was sitting there and the media, Turbyfill announced on behalf of Malak, his boss, that Dr. Malak had felt he'd been treated very rudely during the grand jury proceedings, and that he not only felt harassed by the ongoing and scathing media coverage of him, but he was feeling investigated and persecuted. Turbyfill said, quote, Dr. Malak is, on a daily basis, being kept in the news. He's a very emotional person. And it's difficult for him to do his job with the amount of press that he's getting at this time. He feels that this case is just adding to that pressure. It's not affecting his work as a pathologist, but it's affecting him emotionally and personally, end quote. Oh, poor baby, Dr. Malak. Frankly, my dear, I do not give a damn if you're affected emotionally and personally because your actions have affected others emotionally and personally, and you're a government official who the public has a right to call out if they deem necessary. And I like the fact that Ralph Turbyfill is like, it's affecting Malak's ability to do his job. And then like 2 sentences later, he's like, it's not like making him not a good medical examiner, but like personally and emotionally, it's affecting him. You just said it was affecting the way he did his job. It was preventing him from doing his job in the best way he could. That's what you said. And maybe you think Ralph he's being a little dramatic. Maybe he's being an ass kisser. He wants to get in good with the boss, so he's advocating for him. It's impossible to believe that Dr. Malak was whining about his newfound publicity like an absolute baby bitch boy, right? It's impossible. He couldn't be doing that. But later, when Dr. Malak was asked how accurate Turbyfill's words were, he said, quote, if anything, It was an understatement, end quote. Oh man. For now, I'm going to give the Cliff Notes version of what the grand jury revealed, but we are going to come back to it throughout the rest of this series. Now, specifically, I want to discuss the testimony of Dr. Joseph Burton, who, remember, had performed the second autopsies on Don and Kevin. He not only found that the amount of marijuana in the boys' systems was low, pretty much like they'd shared 1 or 2 or 3 joints with a few friends, which is exactly what happened, according to their friend. What was his name? Matt? Yeah, Matt testified during the trial that night he'd smoked with Kevin and Don, and they'd shared like 2 or 3 joints. So not only did this doctor, Joseph Burton, find that there certainly wasn't anywhere close to enough marijuana in Kevin and Don's systems to cause them to go into a coma, but he also found wounds on both boys that had not been made by the train. Kevin Ives had a crushed skull, as if he'd gotten hit with something blunt in the face, and Don Henry had been stabbed in the back.
Dr. Joseph Burton, a nationally recognized forensic pathologist from out of state, performed the new autopsies. His findings revealed that Don Henry had been stabbed in the back, and Kevin Ives' face had been smashed by a blow from a rifle butt before their bodies were placed on the railroad tracks.
This information alone would strongly suggest that the boys were injured, rendered unconscious, or even killed prior to their bodies being run over by the train.
Burton's autopsies also revealed that Malik had mutilated Kevin's skull by sawing it in so many different directions that it was impossible to tell where the original skull fractures were. Malik also had completely dismantled Kevin's jawbones. Burton stated he had performed thousands of autopsies and had never seen anything like it. Was Malik trying to hide something?
Was there stabbed? The answer is no, they were not stabbed. Were they dead beforehand? Absolutely no, they were alive.
And if all of that wasn't bad enough, a former state crime lab employee came forward and testified that he'd actually discovered evidence of a stab wound during the original autopsy. But his boss, Dr. Malik, had told him not to worry about it. Don't worry about that pesky little stab wound. I'm not interested in doing this autopsy anymore, so we're just going to ignore it. Now, before we wrap up today's video, I want to talk about Dr. Fahmy Malak and the Clinton connection. So, William Jefferson Clinton, also known as Slick Willie or Bill Clinton, was born on August 19th, 1946 in Hope, Arkansas, and he was elected governor of Arkansas in 1978 at the very young age of 32. He was actually the youngest gubernatorial candidate in Arkansas's history. So in the 1980s, during his time as governor, Arkansas was going through some stuff, all right? They became the center of a drug smuggling operation that was being channeled through the Mena airport. And maybe some of you have, some knowledge of this because it was a pretty big deal. But it was CIA agent Barry Seal who had allegedly imported $3 to $5 billion worth of cocaine into the country through that airport. And the operation was also linked to the Iran-Contra affair, which was a scandal involving multiple political figures, including senior members of then-President Ronald Reagan's administration. And basically, these senior members were facilitating the sale of firearms to Iran, even though there was an arms embargo in place. So the operation began to unravel in 1986 when a Lebanese newspaper published a story revealing these secret arms sales. And soon after, a CIA plane carrying weapons to the Contras was shot down in Nicaragua. And the discovery of documents revealed the illegal diversion of arms sale profits to fund the Contra rebels. So when the Mena airport operation was revealed, Bill Clinton was actually accused of knowing about the operation. There was an investigation, but nothing concrete could ever be found to link him to it. And before becoming governor, Bill and Hillary Clinton were involved in something called the Whitewater controversy. It stemmed from a real estate investment deal the couple took part in. In 1978, Bill and Hillary, along with their friends, the McDougalls, invested in a real estate venture called Whitewater Development Corporation, operation for Arkansas. The end goal was to develop property along the White River for vacation homes. And when Clinton was running for president in the early 90s, I think it was 1991 that he was elected, critics suggested that he and his wife had made unethical or possibly illegal decisions regarding their involvement in the project, and the Clintons were accused of financial mismanagement. Special prosecutor Kenneth Starr was appointed to investigate, and although the Whitewater investigation did not result in any charges, the investigation eventually expanded to cover other issues, including the Monica Lewinsky scandal. All this being said, Bill Clinton's political career, whether he was governor or president, it has not been short of scandals and issues like that. But as governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton appointed Dr. Fahmy Malak during his first term. And according to Democratic State Representative Bob Fairchild, Malak was, quote, sort of protected by the governor and the State Crime Laboratory Board, end quote. In 1992, Dateline NBC aired a program making allegations that Bill Clinton looked the other way for years when it came to Dr. Malak's unethical and sometimes illegal practices as the state medical examiner. And Clinton had done this, allegedly, because Malak had helped Clinton's mother, who at that time was an operating room nurse named Virginia DeWire, to cover up the cause of death of a teenager in 1981. So Jesse Chandler, we've talked about him in the prior video. He was a former investigator with the medical examiner's office. He told NBC that Dr. Malak had been afraid to rock the boat and find that 17-year-old Susie Deer had died as a result of a mistake made by DeWire, who's Clinton's mother. Now, according to the Tampa Bay Times, quote, Deer, who was white, was taken to the hospital after being hit in the face by a brick hurled by a 22-year-old black man during a racial incident. The man who threw the brick, Billy Ray Washington, was sentenced to 6 months in jail, but was freed when questions were raised about how Deer died. Hospital records show the girl's injuries were not life-threatening, NBC said. NBC said the nurse, Clinton's mother, had a problem with the breathing tube, re-intubation it's called, and in a matter of seconds, the girl went into complete cardiac arrest and could not be revived. The Emmys report failed to mention DeWire's role or problems in the operating room, NBC said. Instead, Dr. Malak ruled the girl had died as a result of her injuries. Bill Clinton and his mother both obviously denied any connection between Dr. Malak retaining his position and the ruling he made in the Deer case, despite loads of controversy and dozens of reasons why he should have been fired many times. And maybe this girl didn't die from getting hit with a brick in her face, but I still think it was all right that dude served some time behind bars for throwing a brick at somebody's face. Just gonna say that. So the LA Times reported, quote, the governor and his board declined to fire Malak despite more than 4 years of public criticism of Malak's work. The record shows that Malak testified erroneously in criminal cases, that his rulings were reversed by juries, and that outside pathologists challenged his findings. In one instance, he misread a medical chart and wrongly accused a deputy coroner of killing someone. In another, he based court testimony on tissue samples that DNA tests later indicated had been mixed up with other tissue samples, end quote. So this is all going down in the 90s, right? Malak's being called out. So they say 4 years, 1988, 1989, 1990, 1991. It's when Bill Clinton's, going to be a president of the United States. This is when all of this stuff with Dr. Malak became more widespread because Bill Clinton was running for office, and a lot of the people in Arkansas were like, hey, we know he's our son, he's from Arkansas, but dude, he's kind of sketchy. The dude's kind of sketchy, that's all. And we need to have some answers about why he covered up for this man, because like I said, after Malak was a complete clown fool in the Boys on the Tracks case, it's not like this scared him straight. And he started really, making sure he was crossing his T's and dotting his I's. He kept making stupid mistakes. And everyone kept protecting him, right? So let's go back to March of 1988 as Harmon and Garrett were gearing up to bring Kevin and Don's case to a grand jury. Clinton's chief of staff, Betsy Wright, met with crime lab commissioners and recommended the hiring of 2 out-of-state pathologists so that they could review the way Malak was running his crime lab. Okay? This is 4 years before Clinton is going to be running for president. And the same year, that the grand jury and the prosecutor's hearing is happening with the Boys on the Track case. So it's funny because we know, given, the fact that we're in 2024 and I just told you what was happening in the 90s, that nothing ever happens to Malik. But in 1988, everybody's reading this, and all the people who Malik have hurt, they're finally like, okay, dude's going to get what's coming to him. This is finally all going to be exposed. But it turned out that this review was all for show. Not only was Dr. Malik not fired, not even reprimanded, he was given a $14,000 raise.
Nevertheless, both Governor Clinton and the Arkansas State Medical Examiner Commission Chairman, Jocelyn Elders, who had the power to remove Malik from office, not only insisted he remain, they gave him a raise.
Based on the facts I have, I really feel that Arkansas owes Dr. Malik a great debt and a real apology.
Today, the governor was asked if Malik should resign.
I don't think that's a decision that I should make based on what I now know.
It didn't matter what Malik did, whether it was perjure himself in court, fabricate evidence in murder trials, call coroners murderers. Clinton defended him by excusing it as being stressed out, overworked, and underpaid. His testimony compromised evidence in a lot of felony cases in Arkansas. And it was very transparent that Fahmy Malak had some kind of hold over Bill Clinton. The end result was that he was given a $14,000 raise. It was an absolute insult to my family.
Read my lips. I'm not going to comment.
And I was outraged that protecting a political crony of Clinton's was more important than the fact that 2 young boys had been murdered.
So that woman that you heard speaking, Jocelyn Elders, she was actually brought to the White House with Bill Clinton when he was president. He appointed her as the United States Attorney General in 1993, and not long after that, her son was arrested and charged because he tried to sell drugs, cocaine, to undercover detectives. There's that drug connection again. And remember, the Mena Airport operation, it's all going to come full circle. It's all going to get tied back in. Elders wasn't actually Attorney General for that long because she was known in her short time as the most controversial official in the Clinton administration. We could make a whole video about the bad takes that Jocelyn Elders had. And Clinton finally had to fire her in 1994 after she told an AIDS forum made up of hundreds of people that she felt masturbation should be taught to children in schools. I don't know. I don't care what side of the aisle you fall on politically. I don't know how you can look at that statement and be like, yeah, that makes sense. That's a good take. You can't. So that is where we will leave off today. The grand jury would find that both Kevin Ives and Don Henry had died due to foul play. Dr. Malik had done the most to make it impossible to figure out how these 2 boys had actually died. He lied under oath and was called out for dozens of cases where he'd done the same thing, and worse, yet he retained his position. The LA Times reported in 1992, quote, 3 weeks before Clinton announced his presidential candidacy last October 3rd, he pushed Malik to resign. But then the Clinton administration found Malik another well-paying job in state government. It prompted renewed questions about a conflict of interest growing out of Malik's ruling in 1981 that involved Clinton's mother. That ruling, which came between terms when Clinton was out of office, helped Clinton's mother avoid legal scrutiny in one patient's death while she was defending herself in a medical malpractice lawsuit stemming from the death of another patient. End quote. You know what it sounds like? It sounds like Malik did have something on Clinton, right? It sounds like Malik maybe did make that ruling to protect Clinton's mother, and he did this so that he could call in a favor whenever he wanted, right? And especially at this time when Clinton's about to take the White House, go into the White House, does he want Dr. Fahmy Malak coming out and being like, oh yeah, Bill Clinton told me that if I ruled this way on, this case involving his mother, I would be safe and protected. Even if it wasn't true, even if Dr. Malik made the decision to do that himself and then blackmail Clinton later, and Bill Clinton didn't even know that Malik was doing that, Clinton would still not want that to get out because it looks bad for everybody. And so he's pushing Malik to resign. Malik's like, no. So Clinton's like, all right, I'll just get you another good paying government job, but get out of the ME's office because you suck, right? Oh, what a tangled web we weave. and it will grow more tangled as we continue on. But that's a story for another day and another episode and another part of the Boys on the Train tracks. It's getting infuriating. Guys, let me know what you think about this in the comment section. Like the video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you very, very soon. Until then, though, stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay safe. Love you guys so much. Bye.
Don't break now, and the bottle's going straight down.